What's a dark fact you know about a Perth WA building? Stolen from our Melbourne. Hey, St Mall used to have a wide hump as part of the paver finish before the charcoal pavers were laid. That mild dome top is the roof of a massive vault system under the mall that connects to one of the subterranean arcade entries. Perry Lakes has a crawl-able drainage system network like a spider web underneath the fields. Livingston Shopping Centre, and what happened to that little Sophie Rodriguez? Poor love. Google up 3 Moorhouse Street in Willagee, Washington. That Parliament House isn't actually filled with people with the public's best interest in mind. This was fairly common knowledge back then, but the fact the CPP multi-story car park at Wellington ST station was a common point for jumpers. I was unfortunate enough to be passing underneath at the same time one decided to do the uniliving. Missed me by about a foot. That's why there's nets there now. Frio Arts Centre. Built by convicts as an asylum first, then it changed use to a women's home in the late 19th century, and all the horrible things that happened to the marginalized and disadvantaged that you can imagine happened there. At the top of the old RI Tower they've left Bondi's old boardroom bathroom intact. White rhino leather on the walls, spa, sauna, and all. I made sure not to touch any of the surfaces when I was in there. Apparently if you step out onto the balcony up there, you're likely to be attacked by a falcon hawk that lives on top of the tower as well. There are a number of high schools, both private and public, where students have taken their own lives as in they died while in school buildings or grounds, but these are very hush-hush. Old Perth Gale in the centre of the Perth Museum building. Where to begin? Since the 1850s it's been place of over 60 outdoor executions close to the Grapevine, a depot for Aboriginal men being taken to Rottnest, a display room for geological and ethnographic displays including over 50 skulls taken from massacres and burial sites. The Araluen Botanic Park was created as something of a resort by the Young Australia League, an association set up by philanthropist Sir J.J. Simons. He and his mates had a penchant for young boys. Almost every older building on Rottnest Island had some really fucked up stuff happen in them. Basically no bathrooms or showers have been properly waterproofed in WA. The back of now a very popular pub on Stirling Highway, Mosman Park, is where they found the dismembered remains of a young woman, Sharon Mason, in 1992, missing since 1983. My house was built by a dodgy Italian builder and is slowly falling apart. Does that count? Heathcote was a mental institution right up until the 1980s. In one of the buildings a playgroup meets. The room is labelled playgroup, and that was where electroshock therapy was held. Several windows on the Bank West building dislodged themselves and smashed to the ground on St George's TCE. Thankfully no one was hurt, but that's why they installed the catchments and grates around the building. Very quietly reported on a few years ago. 2 doors up from where I lived in West Perth was the house where Eric Edgar Cook killed his last victim. Central Park building doesn't have a 13th floor. Instead, the number of tenanted floors is 51. Also, there was a hush-hush organisation working on 18th floor IRC, unlisted. A tradie got his leg sheared off doing concreting when building Rain Square. The only reason he didn't bleed out was because it was a union site and an RN was on site. I still think about that poor bugger when I see the building. Apartment building corner of Bennett and Goderic Street above that pasta restaurant while under construction. A prefab wall big concrete slab fell off a crane, 2 workers were under it. Dunno about the authenticity of an older one. Back when there was a disused factory end of Hutton at Scarborough Beach End, someone tried to steal copper wire from a mains 3-phase, not realizing it was live. Story goes there were charm marks at the distribution point and the late thief on the opposite wall. This was years ago, before those furniture stores and present-day office works are now situated. Whenever a new group of prisoners would arrive at Rottnest, they would execute one to set the tone. Later, when the body had decayed, they would grind the bones and add it to the mortar for the buildings on the island. There's a lot more incredibly rich people living in gigantic mansions than you realize. I took a walk around Applecross recently and some of the houses were unbelievably big, like palaces. A childhood family friend was murdered in Livingston Marketplace in a disabled bathroom in Canning Vale over 10 years ago. Satanic rituals at the Buckland Hill tunnels. Allegedly a highly radioactive Land Rover buried at Swan Barracks from nuke testing at the Montebellos. Let's not even get into New Norcia, Fairbridge and Moore River. That shit is dark. The underground tunnels are in daily use under Perth. Trucks enter from under Mire and head south. East-west tunnels reach Parliament House. The Woolworths at Dog Swamp Shopping Centre was crop-dusted by a friend of mine one Thursday evening back in 2009. It was about a year after the GFC hit. Those two things are unrelated. Not too dark, but each cemetery has a space reserved in case there needs to be a mass burial. It's usually a scrub-looking area off to the side. DNA Tower in Kings Park has been the site of more than a few unalivings, and body recovery from the top is a pain. This sounds like a Perth Now question. The HJ's on Wanneroo Road in Westminster at Stirling Central. Apart from selling really shitty food, someone OD'd and died in the toilets and their body was not found for like 3 days. Shows how often they clean the place. Any Homestart-built house is a piece of shit. Immediately after it opened in 2018, some kids skateboarded off the roof at the Scarborough Beach Rec Centre and nearly died. Anything that looks like a ramp will be used as a ramp. Also, way more people unilive themselves off anything a few stories tall than people realise. Parliament House is full of Mindory Primary School rape murders late 90s or early 2000. If you want gory details of historic deaths, then look no further than Trove. In the old days the newspapers seemed to enjoy going into the details of a messy death. Montgomery Hall in Claremont has a pretty messed up history, being a mental hospital for years. My wife went down into the basement in the late 80s before it got all redone and there were chains etc. to hold people down there. She said it was the worst feeling she ever had going in there. Now it is a wedding venue. Happy memories for you newlyweds. The Fremantle Arts Centre used to be a museum. Before that it was a psychiatric asylum. As kids we'd visit the museum. We'd take turns locking each other in the padded cell. It had a heavy wooden door with a big sliding bolt. The walls had heavy cotton lagging with leather straps. It had a very high ceiling. There's been plenty of ghost stories about that building. Cutting University's chemistry precinct has negative pressure labs on 3 stories. One lab on the bottom story is constantly getting overwhelmed with sewer gas and other chemical fumes coming from the drains. Students have to evacuate the lab all the time and management's excuse is that a plumber in 2009 said that bad smells may come from the drain occasionally. They refuse to fix the issue because that would be admitting that they have been exposing students to hazardous chemicals since the building opened. I remember when someone jumped of the QT Hotel onto Barrack St. I had heard that the Winthrop Hall Tower at UWA was freely accessible by the public. The reason it's not anymore is because of at least one person taking a walk down to the pavement below after failing their exams. Or it could just be a load of shit perpetuated by UWA students over the last century. Rendezvous Hotel. Drugs, murders and suicides. And they say Perth has no culture. Government tenders are usually won by friends of the government. At one of the zone bowling venues a few guests over time decided to unilive themselves in the bathroom. I don't know how true, but I worked there as a teen and was told this. Warninda Hostel, 4, Welshpool Road, East Vic Park. You could see it from the road when driving through Shepperton Road. Those poor souls who ended up there. Also, not sure if there is a specific house, but Edward Street Baby Farm of Alice Mitchell. There is a building in East Perth where a state public servant committed suicide at his desk in the noughties. It occurred late evening after the cleaners had been and gone. He was found by a colleague the next morning. There is a building in East Perth where a state public servant committed suicide at his desk in the noughties. It occurred late evening after the cleaners had been and gone. He was found by a colleague the next morning. Don't go in there for about 35-45 minutes.